I personally appreciated getting to know her, and we wish her the best in whatever she does come next. Also, before I get started with the agenda, the first selectman could not be here tonight. He had another obligation. He apologized. He called me this morning. At that time, as you all know, Mr. Tetro's brother passed away. I think we recognized that at the last meeting with a moment of silence. I did plan on informing Mr. Tetro this evening that the Board of Finance, our members, have put forth a contribution to the Wounded Warrior Project of $100 in his brother's memory. And I informed the first selectman of that this morning. He was very appreciative and said he would let his brother's widow know, and as well as his dad, and he was extended his appreciation to the board for that. So I would like to thank the members for taking part in that, as well as our clerks. Tonight, we have a rather lengthy agenda. I don't know that the meeting will be extremely long, but the agenda is jam-packed. We're going to hear from the police for watercraft. We're going to hear from the Department of Public Works on several items. We're going to hear from the Clean Energy Task Force. We will ask for a transfer of $10,000 from contingency. And then we have a couple of cleanup items, I would say, for last fiscal year from the Chief Fiscal Officer, as well as the approval of minutes. Is there any questions, comments, concerns from board members before we start? Seeing none, I'm going to call item number 1 on the agenda. We're going to hear from Chief McNamara. And the item is to hear, consider, and act upon the following resolution as recommended by the Board of Selectmen. Resolved that Michael C. Tetro, the first selectman of the town of Fairfield, is hereby authorized to expend in the name and on behalf of the town of Fairfield $304,461 to purchase a CBRNE equipped shallow water vessel to support Fairfield critical infrastructure. 75% of said purchase to be reimbursed by a U.S. Department of Homeland Security Port Security Program grant of $228,346, and the remaining 25%, $76,115, to be funded by the revenue from the sale of the existing vessel and the fiscal 2016 Police Department budget. Can I have a motion to put this before us? We'll take Mr. DeWitt. Do I have a second? We'll take Mr. Stone. The item is now before us. Thank you very much. Chiefs, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Thank you for being here. Why don't you walk us through the item?
Well, yeah, just to kind of give you an overview, you may not be aware of it, so I will share with you that it's probably been about 50 years since the Fairfield Police Marine Division has maintained a footprint of 2 vessels on the water. Obviously, as you can imagine, we have not only a marina, but we also have a great beach area and water area, so our presence on the water during the season is certainly important. And you may also recall that several years ago we received a similar grant, port security grant, from the federal government to buy our larger vessel. That boat obviously is in service, and at the same time we've applied for and received some sustainability money. So the money now utilized to maintain that boat is through a sustainability grant from the federal government. Our smaller vessel is just about 13 years old, and if we looked at our long-term plan for that vessel, probably next year or the year after, that was on our capital non-reoccurring to get that replaced anyway, because the vessel has really reached its limit with regards to public safety use. At the same time, Officer Wiltsey from our department applied for a similar grant to the way we got our larger vessel, and the federal government has provided us with that, or offered us that grant. As a result of that, we have some decisions to make. Obviously, we know that next year we were probably looking, or the year after, looking at replacing that for the full cost, or we can speed that process up and accept the portion from the federal government that's going to allow us to get the boat with a 25% payoff from the department, or from the town. So it's our request through the board that we be granted that. And obviously, I can walk you through, if you want, where we anticipate making up that 25% cost from our current year budget.
We have that note from Deputy Chief Liddy in our package, correct, to Mr. Mayor? It's dated October 16th, right?
Yes, yes.
Does anybody want to go through that? Each line item? Anybody? Okay. Quick question, do we know, in here it's listed, it's $30,000 for the sale of the existing item. Does that, do we know that that's what we're getting for that? Do you
We
already
don't.
have a deal in
We
place?
don't. We did get it appraised, and so we believe that's what we're likely to get for it, but obviously it's going to be market conditions at the time when we sell it. So some of that, so the sale might be, we anticipate that being around $30,000, and at the same time, if you look at item number 2, that's the in-kind allowance. Basically what that is expenditures that we would already generally have that the federal government will allocate for that. We anticipate that possibly going up. So there's a little leeway with some of those two top numbers just based upon the sale. Obviously, we anticipate 30,000. At the same time, we're going to look to negotiate a larger in-kind settlement with the government.
Okay. Any other questions? Mr. Walsh? Did you have one, Bob?
Chief, in regards to the savings that you have listed here, both the reduction where you're trying to offset this by reduction in inventory of vehicle parts by $5,000 and reduction in inventory of ammunition. Are you reducing those inventories, but then we're going to get budgeted double the next year, or are we over inventoried on those items?
I don't.
Now.
We're not necessarily over inventoried.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously by saying that we're reducing it, it would give that appearance. But I think we can maintain our level of the parts that we have, as well as the ammunition we have, by doing that. I mean, we have to make some changes. Obviously, we didn't anticipate having to find this money for this year's budget. So I think by keeping our inventory of parts, I think we can maintain the vehicles the way they are. I don't anticipate next year saying now we need to add 5,000 to it. I just think
Yeah, because
given-
to me, that's another form of financing. It's just saying we're going to finance it, we're going to increase our budget next year to cover this year's costs.
I don't think, ammunition, obviously, we always have a stockpile of ammunition, and I wouldn't recommend us reducing that all the time, but obviously, if we have to make some decisions, I think we can maintain that,
Okay.
that footprint.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Becker?
Yeah, no, I mean, getting in there, yeah, I don't need explanations, but along similar lines, some of these items, they make sense. If you think you've got a fuel reduction, take it out of the budget. But when we talk about the ammunition, and I would assume there's got to be some residual at some point on the, on a light bar. I mean, there's a couple of items that are in here. I guess I asked a question on here of why aren't we contemplating, I mean, there's a contingency account, things come up. Obviously, if there's an issue with the boat, we're getting a grant, why not take a small portion? Maybe that's something for us to discuss as a board, but, I'm not sure, I'm not sure why. Maybe that came up as to maybe one of the options for you and you decided against it, or were told not to do that, I don't know. But for me, I'd rather see maybe a little bit out of your budget, a little bit out of contingency, and a little bit from the sale of the boat, so you didn't have to do some of these types of things. I'd like your inventory to be where you normally keep your inventory. So if we're talking $8,500, and we know that there's money available, why? I guess I asked the question to the board, why not take some of the money out of the contingency for something like this? It seems that the boat and the issues of the boat and the fact that we have a grant in front of us is certainly something we want to make sure we can do, and probably a good use.
Mr. Becker, can I respond in a different way to that?
Yeah, sure, no, it's,
Being that we're so earlier in the year and the major weather events are before us, I would rather than take it out of here, but, to your point, if closer to the end of the year after we know what the weather-related events are, if there's money left in the contingency accounts for that, we can consider it, and maybe they don't have to make these cuts. Would that be?
I know where you're going there. I guess my concern would be what the timing would be on some of these things, right? So if there's an
Would be a
immediate,
delay,
if
not
there's
a-
Yeah, I mean, if they're going to say, we're going to continue operating as normal, and if there aren't any issues like that,
So let's put
then
that to you,
everything's fine.
Jim.
But I don't want to, I guess to my point, I don't want to see a month from now that the inventory is lower than it is right now if we know that there's money. And usually with the storms, I understand there could be major storms, but
We don't know.
even in bad years, that's generally been absorbed throughout the budget and the overall picture.
It's been absorbed
So-
by DPW delaying work in other areas.
Correct, and that brings up a whole nother beast, but I'm saying on their end, I guess I would just want to make sure that these types of items, some of them, maybe some of them not, but some of them don't drop. So if they're gonna immediately start not replenishing inventory because they're going into having a lower inventory, I would say for $8,500, make that not happen. I'm one vote, but that's my.
Thank you, Ms. Beck. Mr. Beck.
Just to follow up what
Yeah.
David had been discussing, is the last item says postpone an anticipated canteen area renovation. And so that's one that, like, I'd rather transfer from contingency. If it's gonna just come back to us in next year's budget, I'd rather, for that small amount, if we have the funds.
Right, if we have the funds when it's available. That's fair. What are what are your gentlemen's thoughts?
What is the question?
Is this gonna, are these expenses, cutting back or delaying on these expenses gonna adversely impact the department in the short term? Or can we delay on moving money from the contingency to cover some of these later in the year?
Yeah, okay, yeah, I don't think short-term, making here, the real important thing is that we have to find the money to
Right.
fill or we're gonna lose the grant.
Right.
So whether or not we, in the short term, taking it from our budget, and then if at the end of the year we find that there's money back, short term, this isn't gonna make a difference.
And if I could add also that the way this particular grant works, the federal government will give us the $270,000 upfront in our account. And the Safeboat International Company would ask for payments as the project goes on. These items would obviously be very last and very well off to the end of fiscal year.
Got it. Does that help?
Yeah, I will, unlike usual, I think, where we oftentimes, I guess my concern is that oftentimes we talk about it, we say we'll come back to it, and then 6 months sort of goes by and everything just sort of falls into place. I guess maybe this time I'll make a note and we'll come back to it because I think it's important that we make sure that these things operate exactly the way they're normally being done.
Okay.
That's
Thank
fine.
you. Mrs. Leclerc, any thoughts?
No, that's it.
Okay. Mr. DeWitt, did you have something? Anybody else? Mr. Walsh?
Just on something separate. In regards to your replacement memorandum here, especially the line, quote, "But the fire department has a shallow water boat," end quote, which I felt like you guys were reading my mind when you wrote that. The question is not so much, because obviously you explained then why your boat is a lot different.
Yep.
And a lot more equipped and whatever. I actually have the opposite question. Can your boat and your service, since you have people on this 24 hours a day, right? Or ready to go at the marina, correct?
Not 24 hours a day, but
Okay.
but generally from 8 o'clock in the morning till ultimately 8 o'clock at night.
The question I guess I have is,
10
do we need the fireboat? That one that they have, that they hook up to a trailer and trailer down and whatever, or is it easier just as a first responder for them, for those calls to come into you, since this is a shallow water? I'm talking about those calls that are on that Penfield Reef calls that seem to come 3 times a year, where someone goes out fishing, the tide comes in too fast, their waders start filling up with water, and it becomes an emergency, and they start screaming to shore.
Sure. It really, to answer your question, it really serves several different purposes. So our footprint at the marina, and the reason we put that in there is just for that reason, is that we know that the fire just got a larger boat from the city of Bridgeport, and they have their smaller boat that can be deployed on the trailer, and then we have ours. So obviously the question is, how many marine assets do we need down there? And I think that I'd let the fire department speak to their
Sure.
needs, but I do think having the overall picture of it, I do think that that trailered boat does serve a purpose.
It does,
Because
okay.
emergencies on the water are so different than a car accident or something on land, because resources can get there from a variety of different locations. When you're on the water, you're really limited to what you have to get out there. So at times, that little fireboat on the trailer can be deployed quicker to Sasko Beach area maybe than our marine assets can get around to get there. So it does serve that purpose.
And I would just add Mill River and Lake Mohegan. Our assets, we really can't get into the
I didn't
water.
think
They
about that.
can quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? So to be clear, this item is not increasing the quote-unquote fleet. It is just replacing a pre-existing piece of equipment that's already been in service.
Yes, and then it has really reached the end of its public safety line.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, I'm going to call this item. Let me read it. Resolved that Michael C. Tetra, the first selectman of the town of Fairfield, is hereby authorized to expend in the name and on behalf of the town of Fairfield $304,461 to purchase a CBRNE equipped shallow water vessel to support Fairfield critical infrastructure. 75% of said purchase is to be reimbursed by a grant from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security fiscal year 2015 Port Security Program grant for $228,346. The remaining 25%, or $76,115, to be funded by the revenue from the sale of the existing vessel and the fiscal year 2016 Police Department budget. All in favor of this item? Opposed, abstentions, the item passes unanimously. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. All right. Item number 2 on the agenda this evening, from the Director of Public Works. I assume this was approved by the Board of Selectmen this afternoon?
Yes, both of the following two items.
Thank you. To hear, consider, and act upon the following resolution as recommended by the Director of Public Works. Resolved that the First Selectman is hereby authorized on behalf of the town of Fairfield to expend up to $250,000 to fund a community development block grant disaster recovery Tranche 2 project entitled Riverside Drive Coastal Resilience and Flood Mitigation Study. 100% of said project costs to be reimbursed by a federally funded disaster recovery community development block grant. Can I have a motion to put this before us? We'll take Mr. DeWitt. We'll second Mr. Brown. Thank you. And the item is now before us. Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Brian Carey. I'm the Conservation Director for the town of Fairfield. I'm sitting in for Joe tonight. I actually put together the grants in association with Joe, Michelangelo, and Laura Pulley.
Thank you, Brian. Please, go right ahead.
So basically, we prepared these grants back in August. There's two in front of you, but the first one is, as you read, is a coastal resiliency and flood mitigation study that's going to be conducted on what we call the Riverside Drive corridor, which basically runs south of the Post Road, down to South Benson Marina where Jennings intersects, and then over to Riverside Drive up towards, again, where Vinnie's is. So this grant is to be provided by the Department of Housing through HUD, and the costs of the study are being funded 100%. There's no in-kind match required for the town. There's no financial match required for the town. So basically, the town would receive invoices and they would be paid up front, and then we'd seek reimbursement from the Department of Housing. The point of the study is to really look at ways to mitigate future effects of not only sea level rise, but also flooding associated with the more intense storms we've seen over the past decade, whether it be your average nor'easter or Hurricane Irene, Sandy. We're going to actually look at trying to incorporate this into the broader mitigation plan that the Public Works is working on right now. So this is a small piece of a larger plan that they're putting together, but the money for this needs to be spent within 8 months.
Thank you. Do we have questions from board members on this item? Mr. Stone?
Not a question, but it's 100% refundable, so I don't even see, why we really have to, I mean, I would never turn something like that down that someone else is paying for.
Thank you, Mr. Stone.
This
Good to
day and
know.
age.
Let's, any other questions from board members? Mr. Walsh?
The study, once we get it back, Brian, is that just going to be going into staff's hands to try to figure out what we think we should do, or is it going to be going to any commissions? Or
No,
anything?
so the Flood and Erosion Control Board, I'm assuming, will have a major part in this, and there will be public input throughout the process. So, what the study reveals, I mean, there may be future costs associated with capital projects involved with that. The town's going to be able to look at that and make recommendations based on the study about how to implement those tasks. One of the things that we're looking to accomplish by doing this study is not just to have a study that we put on the shelf. One of the things we want to do is actually have shovel-ready projects so that when and if there is another disaster, God forbid, we actually have a queue of projects that could actually be funded through a FEMA mitigation process. One of the things that actually happens after you have a disaster, is that FEMA comes in with the mitigation money, but you don't necessarily have a lot of projects that are kind of ready to go. So this would preempt that process. So when and if you would need to have a project ready, we're hoping to have something that's designed 90%. To get us to that point, have numbers and engineering data behind that. So there's a couple projects we're already thinking of that we'll try to put that together as part of this RFQ.
And do we fund all those, the 250, and then we submit one big invoice to get the money back?
Yeah, normally in the past when I've done projects like this, we'll set that up into the actual contract when we select a consultant. You don't want, the study's going to take 8 months or whatever. I don't want 8 invoices. You'll study and do progress payments maybe at 25%, something like that. So that I'll be able to work with the project manager up at the Department of Housing and be ready to know. So we're not sending a lot of money out of our, contingency or whatever, however they're going to pay it. So, there won't be a long overlap. We'll try to time that perfectly, so while we're paying the consultant, we're actually getting the reimbursement soon afterwards. And they're normally very good at paying.
Jim, are you all set?
I'm all set. Thank you, Brian. Very helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Mottola?
I'm just a little confused. So is this a study to figure out how to prevent something happening, or is it sounded like your answer to the question a few minutes ago was, it's a study to figure out if the whole area gets flooded, what type of projects we can apply for and be ready to get reimbursed quickly by FEMA. So is it both? Or?
It's both, yeah. So what they'll actually be doing is looking at ways to increase, resiliency, and also proposing projects that are mitigation. So, first thing they'll do is they'll start modeling storms and flooding events within that area, and see how each storm with different levels of intensity is actually impacting that specific project study area. From that, they'll start looking at projects, whether they be, there's a move for a lot of what they call green infrastructure projects, where actually are more built into a natural type of environment. You're looking at wave dispensation rather than hard structures, where you're building flood walls, which costs a lot. So the idea, the scope of the project is to kind of throw all of that, look at all of those types of mitigation measures, and kind of come up with an approach that maybe implements this on this particular issue and this on this particular issue. But at the end of the day, we want some projects that have been designed. I mean, there's a couple that are already sticking out in mind, which is actually, if you go down Riverside Drive, there's the Tidegate culvert system. I mean, that needs to be addressed. So we're hoping, and that would be something that would need to be addressed by the town even if we weren't doing this. So that's kind of in the water flow chart that's been provided. So we want to address that using these grant funds to kind of defer some of the costs the town would have to come up with in the future. So we have a couple ideas, but the other idea is no preconceived notion. This is an independent third-party consultant who'll be looking at this, independent of the Erosion Flood Control Board, Public Works. So they'll come back with a study that hopefully will come back, provide us a varying degrees of mitigation.
Can I follow up? Mr. Mayor, thank you, Brian. It was just mentioned the waterfall chart. What has been set aside for these types of mitigation projects within our capital planning? Do you know what the amount is? I know we don't have finalized numbers. It's just when we were looking at the capital planning chart, did we have money in there? I just can't remember as I sit here for flood mitigation projects moving forward.
There are a couple items in there, one for 5 million, one for 4 million. I'm not sure specifically what they're for,
Okay.
but
I knew there was something in there, I just couldn't remember the numbers, but that's in our modeling going forward.
Right.
So if in fact we do a study, it comes back with something that needs to be addressed more urgently than we thought, we have some type of allowance put aside, at least for some of it.
well, as we know, that's a working document. We'd obviously have to bring it through the process. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Are there any other questions? Mr. Becker?
Thank you. So, on the areas, obviously, that we're concerned with, kind of two parts. What other areas now, or how many, maybe, kind of broadly, still need studies done that were, and is there any sort of a plan to get either more grants or to come through the boards for that? And then, sort of in the decision-making process, how did you target, just a brief description about how you targeted these areas and maybe not some other ones? Because obviously we have a big coastline, I get it, not everything can get done right away, but I mean, I would assume the goal would be, to hit everywhere at the end.
Well, there is another study that, and Joe Michelangelo could talk about this more in depth, but there's another study that they're trying to get off the ground, working with the Army Corps of Engineers. And I don't know the complete specifics of this, but there's money that's been provided to a number of municipalities from Jim Himes, and they're trying to work with DEP and Army Corps to get that study off the ground. And that's looking more, along the coast of the beach, and that's really what you've seen the Flood and Erosion Control Board targeting as their main objective. This was put forward as a grant after we had internal discussions, because this was one of the main issues that the Flood and Erosion Control Board had come up with in their basically in their list of priorities. And it's a lot easier to tackle than the entire town. We already know that there's some deficiencies that we could address through this type of grant, because these funds, the town's been pretty successful in getting these CDBGR funds because we were able to move the money quickly, more so than some of the other towns. So we basically went forward with this because we knew we could put together a project quickly and get the funds. And it's a smaller study area than the whole town, so it's more manageable. Could probably be done within the time frames allowed underneath what the grant is kind of requiring us to do.
Okay. And then also just along the lines of the study and who gets it, I would think certainly our board, but probably everybody, it would be good when these are done to get copies. I know that we
Yep.
approve things and then they kind of go, and it would actually be nice if you guys could make a note and maybe circulate it when it comes out. Because I think that'd be helpful for us to
My
get that
goal would be to put it
understand.
on the website. I mean, it's a public document. I mean, if this will be going through a public process, there's no reason not to have it available. We'll be
Yeah,
looking
no,
for input.
even better. Maybe a note when it's up, but
Yep.
even better, yeah, on the website, that'd be great. Thank you.
Mr. Walsh?
I have a question, and maybe it's for Mr. Mayor, and maybe our chairman could assist. But in regards to the funding of this, since there's not a bond resolution, we advance these funds out of a budget, or do we do it out of our general fund, and then we get reimbursed back into that fund? How does that work? So it's, and my question applies to, just to speed this up, for the next item as well. 250 and then 100,000. So we're going to spend the money, out
If
of,
they're 100% reimbursable, we'll set up a grant fund.
okay, okay. So we set up a grant fund that goes into the negative while he spends the money, and then it gets reimbursed later
Right.
on. Okay,
Goes into the negative from the general fund,
great.
correct?
Okay,
From cash on hand, right.
great. I just wanted to know the mechanics. Thank you.
Any other questions on this item? Seeing none, are you guys going to make me read this, or are we sufficient so that it can? Okay, so I'm going to call it for a vote. Sure. Yes.
I make a motion to waive the reading of agenda item number 2.
Do I have a second? All in favor of waive? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. The item is now before us. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? The item passes. We'll go on to the second one. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Walsh, for not wanting to hear me read it again. Okay. Here's this item, number 3, is the Department of Public Works to hear, consider, and act upon the following resolution as recommended by the Director of Public Works. Resolved that the First Selectman is hereby authorized on behalf of the Town of Fairfield to expend up to $100,000 to fund a Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Tranche 2 project entitled Fairfield Engineered Beach Study. 100% of the said project cost to be reimbursed by a federally funded disaster recovery community development block grant. Brian, back to you. This is essentially the same thing, is that correct?
It's a little different, but
Okay.
yes, along the same lines. So one of the issues that's arisen, not just in Fairfield, but throughout the state after we had Hurricane Irene and Sandy, was actually repairing damage to the beach, town-owned beaches. FEMA, if the towns don't meet a regulation under FEMA's code, not to bore you, but 9580, which requires, a litany of things to meet the definition of what's called an engineered beach, then they will not reimburse the town for any damage to the beach. Meaning, what happens during the coastal storm, it's either eroded or the sand comes in and washes it into the parking lot. Town's required to go back out there and reconstruct a beach in a manner that the public expects it to be when the summer comes back. None of the towns in the state really were able to meet this standard because there's a long list of maintenance requirements and also design requirements that if you're not meeting those requirements, FEMA will not reimburse you, so you can't make your 25-75 split. So the goal of this project is to do a study to bring the town into compliance with that FEMA standard. So we're going to basically look at all the beaches in town, all the town-owned beaches, and put together, bid packages to, basically get to the point where we can determine, how far off we are from meeting the requirements of FEMA. So if and when we have another disaster, that the town would be in a position that they could seek, your standard 75-25 split from FEMA.
Thank you very much for the explanation. Anybody have any questions on this item? Seeing none, can I have a motion to waive the reading?
So moved.
Second. All in favor of waiving the reading? Opposed, abstentions? All in favor of the item? Opposed, abstentions? The item carries unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming out tonight. And good luck with the projects. Item number 4, Clean Energy Task Force. To hear, consider, and act upon a following resolution as recommended by the Board of Selectmen. Resolved that Michael C. Tetro, First Selectman of the Town of Fairfield, is hereby authorized to expend $18,000 to lease an electric vehicle, purchase and install a charging station at Jennings Beach, purchase 2 electronic charging stations from United Illuminating, one of which will be relocated, and purchase clean energy promotional items such as LED bulbs and funds to be 100% reimbursed by a Clean Energy Community Program grant. Do I have a motion? Put it before us. I'm going to go with Mrs. Leclerc, second Mr. Mottola. Before I move on to the item, good evening, Mr. Michelangelo. I'm going to point out that this memorandum of understanding is made between ourselves as the town and the Connecticut Green Bank, which is a quasi-public agency of the state of Connecticut. I happen to serve on the board of directors for the Connecticut Green Bank, and I am going to abstain from this vote not because I do not support the program, but because I don't think being on both sides of the transaction, both for the town as well as for the Connecticut Green Bank, is appropriate. Okay? So I will turn it over to you guys to discuss any questions from board members, or Mr. Michelangelo. Why don't I let you walk us through it, and then we can go.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. The Clean Energy Task Force pursued this program. They were awarded this grant for $18,000 divided into 4 of the different components, equally divided, $4,500 for each. So as a municipality, it gives us the opportunity to be a showcase for a lot of these green technologies, such as electrical vehicles, providing charging stations, bulbs and alike. So we're doing a lot of those things anyway. A lot of private companies are doing that also. But it's an opportunity that the town has to take part in this program. Clean Energy Task Force is excited about it, and they'd like to go forward with it. There is no out-of-pocket cost to the town. The $18,000 that's outlined in the MOU, it's not a cumbersome process to get the money back. It's not a difficult reimbursement process. It's basically a on-time payment back to the municipality, and they're all worthwhile projects that we'd like to pursue.
Thank you, Mr. Michelangelo. Mr. DeWitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Mr. Michelangelo. Do we not have charging centers over on Mill Plain Road today?
There's currently one at the Park Rec building as part of the solar project, and there's also one at the Fairprint lot.
Okay. So municipality has advised that it will use the reward funds to purchase or lease the following items. So it seems like $18,000 to lease or purchase a town vehicle, an electric vehicle, and a charging station, and for Jennings, and 2 more, and LEDs. That sounds like that $18,000 goes a long way. Is that, you can really buy all that for $18,000 and no charge to the town?
Yeah, and the first item's a lease, so the vehicle that's envisioned is a Nissan Leaf, which is a, lower cost vehicle, and it's anticipated for about 36 months, and that will most likely be used by one of our department heads, either engineering or health or planning and zoning. 12,000-mile limit per year, just like a typical lease, but it's more of a showcase for this program and for the town of Fairfield.
And after 3 years, we would take the responsibility for the lease, or?
Well, either we, like any other lease, either purchase it or return our vehicle. There's no plans to outright purchase it, so.
Okay. I was curious to read some of the comments that said, we were going to become a showcase, when, I kind of think we are a showcase in that we're, again, Mill Plain Road, center of town, there's charging stations here already, so maybe it was meant for a more general
Correct.
document, but,
Sherman Green, but we'd like to continue that.
right, got it. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mottola.
I'm just curious, why did you choose Jennings Beach to put the charging station as opposed to, just because there's a lot of room down there? Or?
Well, and it's it is a lot of room down there, and there could be other locations.
Okay.
We've envisioned that the Marina or even Independence Hall. One of the
Gotcha.
problems with having a dedicated spot to it, when you already have a parking crunch, it's tough to have a dedicated spot where this is to promote good thoughts, and if a parking spot is empty because it has a charger there when people don't have any places to park.
That would be a bad thought,
Yeah.
then? Okay.
Negative
all right,
connotation.
Gotcha. All right, fair enough. Thank you.
Mr. Stone.
Who pays for the electricity that's used when these cars are charged?
Well, in some instances, like at the Park Rec
Yeah.
facility, and possibly at the we're envisioning, if it's in conjunction with a solar project, the power is free. Otherwise, the charge is borne by the town.
Mr. Becker?
But the power isn't free, because if they're using the solar, then we're not using the solar or kicking it back to the grid, right? So there is a cost ultimately, right?
Correct, yeah.
Can we get, as maybe a follow-up, some idea of maybe some of the stats of what the usage is? I mean, because these spots seem like I get the showcase, and every once in a while you see a car, but I feel like, to your point, kind of about tying up a spot, and then if it's empty, these spots are empty all over town for the most part. So I'd be curious to see just how much use maybe they actually get, and then just from a cost basis, I would be curious. It's very nice, but if there is a cost to it, and I mean in a lot of different ways. It would just be nice to get that information, and the next time maybe because I would assume there's going to be another one of these at some point that comes up, then we'll be a little bit more notified of kind of that information. All right.
Mr. Mayor, can you
Perfect,
note Mr. Becker's request for a follow-up on that? Thank you. Any other questions? Mrs. Leclerc?
Yeah, I thought I understood, and then you confused me a bit. On these 4 items, right above it, it says funds to purchase or lease the following items. So exactly which ones would we be buying, and which ones are we leasing?
Well, the lease is the vehicle,
Okay.
and the other are for the installation of the units. So.
So that's all purchased, okay. So it's, and if we were to buy that type of vehicle, how much would it cost to buy it?
Offhand, I don't know the list price of that vehicle.
Okay. But you've considered both options, and it's,
Well, under this program, for this amount of money, obviously for the money involved, we would not be able to purchase a vehicle for this amount of money that's in this program.
okay.
Just a quick question, clarification. The agenda item states that it's 100% reimbursed,
Correct.
so the cost is zero.
Right.
No, that wasn't a question, though.
Money, and then the comment was made that
Just
we
its
could either,
electrical cost.
it could be zero if we decide not to either lease it for it or buy it.
That would have to come back before the body, or in a budget somewhere.
Right.
So the only cost is going to be, I mean, I don't know if the electricity cost is going to be reimbursed, but everything else is reimbursed, so it's the cost, is just to use electricity.
Yeah, I don't think that was the question. The question was just if you were going to go to buy the car as opposed to lease it, how much?
The conversation with, like, Mr. Becker's comments is, I was getting the impression maybe people didn't understand it was fully reimbursed.
Yeah.
Well, do we have to do all 4 pieces? That's what, or is that just what you chose to do?
Well, that's the arrangement that the Clean Energy Task Force saw and received. So
Okay.
if it is to be, if one part isn't acceptable, we could send it back to them to possibly modify it.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Any other questions? Mr. Walsh?
How much how much electricity is used out of these charging stations on average, like the one that's on the town green?
Yeah, offhand, I don't know. I think that
Oh, okay.
dovetails with
Yep.
Mr. Becker.
Yep.
The usage and the cost of them, that's something that we'll look up.
Any other questions?
No, just, I mean.
Mr. Becker?
Yeah, and reading through the document that was provided with the agreement, it notes kind of the hard assets as the reimbursed, but it doesn't talk about any sort of reimbursement on the electricity part. So I think that's why that came up. I mean,
Right.
just it doesn't say anything about that in there, so. It's probably pretty negligible, but just,
Absolutely.
knowing, that's all.
Thank you. Any other? Okay, seeing none, Can I have a motion to waive the reading of this? Everybody. I will take Mr. Mottola and Mr. Stone, all in favor of waiving the reading? Opposed, abstentions? Okay, we'll waive the reading. I'll call the item for a vote. I will be an abstention on this. All in favor? Opposed, and one abstention. Thank you, Mr. Michelangelo. All right, we'll move on to item number 5. It's to hear, consider, and act upon a transfer of $10,000 from the contingency fund to the IT department for consulting services to perform a needs assessment for a new telephone system for the town. Mr. Mayor, you're going to speak to this?
Yes, sir. As I think everyone is aware, the town's telephone system is antiquated and breaks down frequently, and spare parts are becoming more and more difficult to find. We actually had a breakdown in the fire department a couple months ago that was difficult, took some time to get back up. We have I've had discussions with several people who are involved in the industry about the the different options and how you get to where you need to be, i.e. how do you select an option, price an option, et cetera, et cetera. And we have not requested an RFP yet or anything, but I believe that for about $10,000, based upon my discussions, we could probably get someone to come in, take our inventory, and give us some intelligent ideas about, given who we are, what we do, what we're trying to do, what might be the best direction to go, what vendors to speak to, et cetera. In addition to those discussions, I've had discussions with the chair of this board, who has some contacts that we'll be talking with as well, which may preclude us from having to spend this money, but we're getting to the point now, and about the IT, the way it is, where I think we can handle this and move this forward, but I just want to get it started sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We'll go to Mr. DeWitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That, as is always my particular problem and others on this board with doing anything with IT, is that we don't have an IT plan. To spend $10,000 to talk about phones, and I know, small amount, but to not know what our overall plan is for IT for the town, it seems like it's putting the cart before the horse. So I can't see myself voting for this, just because of the fact that we don't have an overall plan.
I think the IT plan is separate and different from the need for telephone system.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Mr. Mayor, does anybody else have a comment on this? Go to Mr. Stone.
I know this is government, so it's a lot different than we do it at our homes, but we don't ask a couple of companies to come in and evaluate what we need and give us a price? I mean, it's just not done that way, I assume? I mean, 10,000 is trivial. I'm not questioning that. I'm just, do you know where I'm getting at?
There's a dozen companies. I mean, there are many companies out there that you can work with. Obviously, there's some big ones, some small ones, some medium-sized ones. There's different types of systems. This approach would be kind of like the guy comes in. We've been taking the inventory, so we kind of have our inventory down. We have our inventory. We do a little bit of analysis of what we do, what the town is, what we try to do. He identifies, the pros and cons of different types of systems and the vendors of each of those types, and then we go from there.
Mr. Stone, can I take a stab at answering that? Just the way I've seen it done in the private sector for companies, and by the way, you're absolutely right. One way to go about it is to bring the phone company in and have them basically do what amounts to a needs assessment, and then say, oh, by the way, we have a system that we can sell you that can do this, right? And another way to do it is hire somebody that does not work for a phone system, that is an independent person that actually does not get paid based on you, based on selling you a phone system. So what they do is come up with an independent view of saying, hey, you don't need that, you don't need this, this is really what you need. And they're independent, and then they basically run the process, or can run the process, to send it out to the various phone companies and then evaluate what they get back. And the good part of that process is presumably that person, A, is independent, and B, they're an expert. So they're looking at leveling the bids after that and saying, hey, phone company one, you're trying to sell me a bill of goods here. Phone company two, you're also trying to sell me a bill of goods. Let's bring it back to exactly what my needs assessment says that I need. So in essence, that the hope for is that independence will allow you to get a better decision from an educated third party as opposed to somebody that's just trying to sell you more than what you need. That's what I've seen in the past. Is that inaccurate?
Very well said, as always, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I question this as well, as Mr. Mayor put forth. Go ahead, Mr. Walsh. I hope I answered.
Thanks, Tom, for that summary, because I think you did a very good job in summarizing it, as well as did Mr. Mayor. I personally believe that this is a de minimis amount of money to spend to be able to purchase the knowledge we need to help us make a decision independently, without having a salesperson from a specific company come in and try to tell us what we need, at what price they sell it for, and all this other stuff. While maybe it would be nice to have an IT director who has a specialty in phone systems, I don't even know whether we have an IT director now or not. So that's a whole different discussion. But
We do not.
okay, but the bottom line is that whether we did or we didn't, we don't seem to have this expertise in-house. So I think for $10,000, this is a wise investment of our money to be able to get to a decision on a phone system we've been talking about purchasing for, to me, it seems like the last 4 years. But we keep putting off because we didn't seem to have the expertise to be able to make a decision in-house. So I think it'd be wise for us to go down this road. This technology has been changing dramatically, whether it's being handled over the internet, whether it's being handled, there's services that you buy where you hire a company and you buy specific services in-house from them versus having the equipment at your place. But we need to have a complete analysis, because this is going to be a large number when it comes to us. And in order for us to be able to analyze that, I think we're all going to have to, at least at this table, let alone at the Board of Selectmen and RTM, have enough confidence and knowledge to be able to make that decision to determine whether we want to spend that money.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Brown, did you have something?
Well, first, I agree with Mr. Walsh. This is, I believe, the right approach. You know, we all, our company has our own IT department, but if they were going to determine a new phone system, they would want to get some outside advice as well, which we have done. But a question, do you have any idea, do we have any idea what the total cost could possibly be for a new phone system? Range?
Yeah, I am drawing a blank. Because I did do some back then, and I apologize for not bringing those numbers with me, some back of the envelope type of numbers, because it's part of it depends, like, for example, if we want phones in each of the classrooms. Some people say we do, but then what type of phone? Because there's some type of phones that cost less than other type of phones. But I would hate to throw out a number right now because I'm just not recalling.
This is for Board of Ed as well?
Yes.
Okay. And every town department?
Yes. Police, fire, everybody.
Okay. Emergency services?
Yes.
Why it needs to be in the IT?
This is why you need, right, but this...
Well, it's a telephone system. Obviously it's connected. It depends on what kind of system you get. When we get down the path, we want to make sure we have the proper connectivity, the LAN network, the WAN network, all that stuff. So eventually it will tie in, but to get started, it's distinct and separate.
When do you plan on getting started?
Well, I'm going to get started with the study fairly rapidly.
Mm-hmm. Any idea how long the study will take?
No, not just 2 months maybe when we get somebody aboard.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Becker.
On that point about the IT plan, and I understand, on the phone system, but there are going to be some, if you move, I would assume you're going to move to some sort of a VoIP system. That's probably almost a given. There's a couple of different options on that end, some with more or less infrastructure needs, but there's likely to be, from an additional bandwidth need, some sort of infrastructure that's going to go with it that's not really phone-related, but more IT-related.
That's what I'm saying, the WAN and the LAN are going to need to be, yes.
Yeah,
We're going to need to
that's
make sure
gonna
we
fit
buy,
in.
we're going to, yeah, we need to evaluate that as well, correct.
Yeah. So is this going to cover that, or is IT, because at one point you had wanted, I want to say it was 2 budget cycles ago, and there was talk about bringing in an additional hire, or for, I
Well,
want to say it
you're-
was on
you're-
the
you're-
networking side because
Yeah,
of that.
you're talking about the budget request from the former IT director.
Correct. So, yeah, not you. You may represent on the finance side, that's it, yes, not you. But there was a request, and it brought up, as much as I disagree with him on most things, to some extent, the fact that there's you drop that much on the network side, there's going to have to be some sort of an overhaul to be able to support this. So is the current IT going to be able to kind of address, so the phone consultant comes in and goes, okay, this is the direction I think you need to go. Let's go out. We'll come up with the specs and the pricing and all of that. But by the way, in order to do this in this school and I guess that,
Then-
how about in this town building, the police station, the fire stations, whatever, they're going to need this amount of additional bandwidth.
Correct.
This set of routers.
Right.
IT will then handle that side
Yes,
internally
totally,
now?
yeah, yes. And by then, hopefully, we'll have an IT director.
Okay.
Because we're actually, just for information purposes for the board, we're actually, as you know, we've hired the deputy chief of fire department, the chief of the fire department. We're currently recruiting for purchasing director, HR director, and IT director.
You're busy. Okay.
Mr. Mayor, question for me. How old is the existing phone system?
I think it's 30 years old.
How long has it been in the budget or has it been on the docket to get this system addressed?
It's been there since I started working for the town, so sometime prior to that, I don't know.
Do we have, you had mentioned before that we have failures of the phone system. Are those,
Correct.
what's the frequency of that?
We only had one actual super failure. We have equipment that goes out, and we have to
Right.
replace equipment. There was only one failure. That was about 5 months ago, I think. It took some time to get things back up.
From soup to nuts, how long is this? So this is step one, which is basically a needs assessment.
Correct.
From this date until implementation, how long are we typically talking? Do you have any?
Oh, I think if everything aligned properly, with respect to filling the IT slot, doing analysis, budget process and approvals, it's a year plus.
My guess is, I want to go back to something Mr. DeWitt said, because I want to make sure we're sensitive, and Mr. Becker, to those comments. This is the study. This has nothing to do with the actual implementation. So,
That is a correct statement.
so you would not be starting on the implementation until such time as we have somebody in the chair. And
Or make a decision how we do it. That doesn't, I'm not sure that we need a staff person. It depends on what kind of system that we purchase. Whether we, if it's all in the cloud or part of the cloud or.
You would have to come back to us anyway for the
Correct.
funding for this.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Becker.
Well, first, it's good to hear people acknowledging the cloud exists here. So, yeah, no. On that side, on the internet side, I mean, it does bring up, from an infrastructure, sort of along the lines of what I'm talking about. You bring up the reliability. One of the interesting things is, as much as these are antiquated, they're highly reliable because there aren't that many parts, right? When you get into VoIP, you don't have enough bandwidth, or if the internet goes out, if you don't have redundancy, I mean, you'll just lose the phone system, or you'll get, degraded call quality. I mean, there's a number of
There's a VoIP,
on that.
yeah.
It opens up a whole can of worms that if that infrastructure isn't done right and doesn't,
Oh,
doesn't
there's
have redundancy,
backup if
you'll
there's
lose it
Storm
right away.
Sandy, there's because you don't have the piece of hardware. But
So-
also to speak to what you said, not parts, with our current system, parts is an issue, because they don't make them anymore.
Yeah,
Basically,
no,
it's all
that's-
cannibalized parts from,
Yeah.
you know, phone yard, phone.
Phone
junkyards.
graveyard?
Phone graveyard. Phone graveyards.
And of course, this, to poke at my age, about the time I was in elementary school, these were put in, so. But, I'm young, but I guess I am aging. 30 years, that's amazing, the system.
That's, I mean, I wasn't here,
Yeah.
but that's what I was told.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. We've seen them for a long time, so, yeah. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Walsh.
Mr. Mayor, just to follow up on Mr. Flynn's question, is your goal to get this, us approve it, get it through, order your study, so that we're going to get money in this next year's budget cycle to
It'd be-
either fund this?
It'd be great to get that far, but it's, there will probably be, I'm not certain that we're going to need to hire someone. So that's, you know, that may or may not be an issue sometime down. But at this point, I'm not looking towards increasing the staff because of this, but I might change my mind.
I meant hiring the IT director, not necessarily the telephone.
Right, we will be hiring that, right, but we're not, the telephone engineer, system engineer, I'm not looking to expand the system engineer staff at this time, engineering staff. We will probably get this study, get a sense of where we're going, hopefully around the same time, have some success interviewing, bring an IT director aboard. Then, after that point, we get the analysis done, we get the RFP, it's going to take some time to get the RFP out, and then it's going to take some time to install the system. Installing the system could either be done with a consultant or a hire. At this point, I'm thinking it will be, this is step one of a consultant, there'll be step two of a consultant, and then there'll be the system install.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this item? Seeing none, I'm going to call this one for a vote. Okay, and it's item number 5, to hear, consider, and act upon a transfer of $10,000 from contingency to the IT department for consulting services to perform a needs assessment for a new telephone system for the town. All in favor of this item? Opposed? There's one opposition and abstentions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Item number 6, to hear, consider, and act upon a request from the Chief Fiscal Officer to approve Schedules A, B, C, D, E, F, carry over funds for encumbrances and reappropriations as of June 30th, 2015, is supported by purchase orders or letters of request by department heads or the Chief Fiscal Officer. To have this put before us, we'll go with Mr. Walsh, second and Mr. Brown, and the item is before us.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'd like at this time for items numbers 6, 7, and 8 to introduce someone who obviously needs no introduction, our current controller and former esteemed clerk of the board, Caitlin Bossy, to take us through these.
Thank you. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We keep pulling you back in.
Do.
Yeah.
This is clearly something that you guys see every year. Schedule A is on the town side, just the current year POs carried forward. Just to give you a feel, because you probably don't have it, last year the amounts were similar. If you look at Schedule A in conjunction with Schedule B, as opposed to the Water Pollution Control A, but those two numbers add up to about 225. The number last year was about 240, so it's in the ballpark of where we are, where we have been the last couple of years. The bottom part of the sheet, Schedule A, is the Water Pollution Control current year POs. Again, they're self-supporting funds, so they really don't impact the general fund all that much. Listing, you guys got a listing of the POs associated with all those, nothing really out of the ordinary. Again, the amounts are in line with where we've been. Anyone have any questions on those?
Any questions, Mr. Walsh?
Register of voters pressing need for the $150
Yeah.
PO.
Yeah.
This doesn't surprise me from there. Thanks.
Schedule C are the reappropriations, which are really the same thing as an encumbrance, except for the fact that there's not a PO issued for them. You have a memo from Don Ross talking about the $50,000 asked to be carried forward. It's in relation to the reval contract, and it's basically a retainage fee that hadn't been paid out yet, so we're carrying forward that as part of the contract. D is nothing. E is the Board of Ed, again, the same thing. Current year POs carried forward, and F didn't have any POs that were more than a year old to be carried forward. So those amounts will increase the budget in fiscal 16 to be spent in fiscal 16. But again, all in line with last year's amounts, so there's nothing really out of the ordinary for those.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh.
The BOE was in line with previous years?
The BOE is 637 this year.
Yeah.
Last year was 573,
Okay.
so.
Any other questions, comments, concerns from board members? Seeing none, I'm going to call for a vote on item number 6, to hear, consider, and act upon a request from the Chief Fiscal Officer to approve Schedules A, B, C, D, E, F, carrying over funds for encumbrances and reappropriations as of June 30th, 2015, as supported by purchase orders or letters of request by department heads or the Chief Fiscal Officer. All in favor? Opposed? Abstention? The item carries unanimously. Thank you. Go to item number 7, to hear, consider, and act upon a request from the Chief Fiscal Officer to transfer $1,734,803 from contingency to various accounts per the attached schedule in the fiscal year 16, so assume that should be 2016, year for the Fire and Police Department settlement, correct? Okay. Can I put that before us, Mr. Walsh? Second, Mr. DeWitt. And who's going to speak to this item?
I will.
Okay.
As you guys are aware, the fire and police settled for fiscal years 14 through 17. Recently, they passed the RTM. So it's a 4-year contract. I believe it's about a 2.49% per year. So this amount, this 1.7, represents fiscal 16 amounts that are in contingency in the budget in 16 that just need to get transferred over to the fire and police accounts that are listed on your sheet.
And this calculation was done, it's 1.75, is that what you said?
It's 1,734,000.
Yeah,
Which is
okay.
the 2.4,
It is
basically
the 2.4.
compounded from 14.
For the couple of years.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so it's the entirety of the last several years,
This is the fiscal 16 amount,
just the 16
because the
amount.
14 and 15 are already put
Closed.
aside
Right,
in accrued salaries.
right.
Yeah. So this amount is strictly the amount in contingency in fiscal 16 that needs to get transferred over to the operating departments as the retro's been paid, and now their salaries are now increased in those accounts.
Got it. Let me ask you a question. Here we have, if I pull up this document, we have 2015 transfer activity?
That's for agenda item number 8.
Got it, okay. It's not labeled real well, okay.
7 is strictly the fiscal 16 fire and police.
Got it, okay. Thank you, because it wasn't labeled, the backside mine's cut off, so I didn't see it. Yeah. Questions? Mr. Walsh?
It seems like a lot of money, but I presume it just is what it is. Just seems like, you know.
It's the 2.49 compounded.
Yeah. The question is, I guess this is more to Mr. Mayor, is do we have any calculation in maybe what we put away versus what we're now paying out
Most definitely.
for this?
Yes, sir.
And would you be able to provide that in an executive session at maybe some point?
I was going to ask that, thank you, Mr. Walsh, because I think we talked about this, I think, at one of our last meetings, about getting stepped through what's left in the contingency, because the contingency account's becoming quite unwieldy from the standpoint of we've had so many contracts that have been outstanding for so long that it's hard to really put a number on what's left in the contingency, and to Mr. Walsh's point, where we're kind of covered and where we're not. So we do have, and it's an item I want to talk about later, the quarterly review coming up. And what I'd like to do is put on that quarterly review to go out back
Okay.
into private executive session and get stepped through. And it's probably good practice because we are, believe it or not, going to be on budget season soon. So it'd be good practice to actually get up to speed on where the contingency account stands.
Right, I agree.
Does anybody have a problem with that? Okay. Okay, thank
Okay.
you. What, any other questions on this account right now? On this transfer? Mr. Walsh?
I'd just like to move it.
Okay. Do we have a second? We'll go with Mr. DeWitt. Okay, the item is before us to hear, consider, and act upon a request of Chief Fiscal Officer to transfer $1,734,803 from contingency to various accounts per the attached schedule in the fiscal year 2016 for the fire and police settlements. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? The item carries unanimously. Thank you. And we'll go to item number 8, to hear, consider, and act upon a request from the Chief Fiscal Officer to approve transfers at 2015. So here's 2015.
Okay, there's 4 parts to this. You can look at it in 4 parts. The number 1 is contingency from fiscal 15. So we had, if you guys remember from the quarterly, 1.2 left, and then we threw an additional 500 in there, getting up to the 1726 number. So we have to use overages from the other departments to make up for the 500, because we had 1.2 in contingency. So those other, the H&H, the property insurance, had slight underages in their expense lines, so we use those. Again, it's just a budget-to-budget transfer item. So that's number 1. And there is a backup to, I have to allocate it out by department for the various contracts that are still open, and they're listed on agenda item 8-2, just because it has to go account by account.
Yep.
So that's number 1. Number 2 are all of the smaller departments that had slight overages that we, again, spoke about in the quarterly. And we took some extra room in the solid waste and recycling. Again, transfer to transfer only. 3 was the debt service piece, the unemployment comp, the 107. And lastly was basically to find coverage for the 641 that DPW was over due to electricity and snow.
Right, and this was due to the heavy winter and all the snow.
Correct. So it's
Basically,
still,
the
it's
item
still
I
not
was referring
affecting the
to
bottom
before.
line. These are simply just transfers because legally by department, we can't be over.
Yeah, and this is all cleanup for 2015 for the audit, correct?
Correct.
Do you have any questions, comments, or concerns on these? And this all ties back to what we saw at the quarterly, right?
Correct.
Mr. Becker, please.
And actually, the principal point kind of from earlier in the evening about DPW, right? To some extent, they absorb it in their budget, but also
Yep.
it gets absorbed out to the whole picture,
Yep.
right? And that's what we're kind of doing. Okay.
Okay, any other questions, comments? Seeing none, I'm going to call this item. Okay.
Mr. Flynn, nobody brought it before the.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you bring it? Mr. Brown, second, Mr. Walsh, thank you. Okay, so, item number 8, to hear, consider, and act upon a request for the Chief Fiscal Officer to approve transfers as of June 30th, 2015. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That carries. Thank you. Okay, now we get on to approval of minutes. Ms. Spassi, thank you very much. We have 3 sets of minutes before us tonight. We can go one of 2 ways. Let's take them each separately, just in case somebody was absent and wants to abstain from those minutes. So the first minutes I'll bring before us are from our September 1st, 2015 meeting. I'll take Mr. Brown and I'll take Mr. Mottola to second these minutes going before us. Any questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none. All in favor of these minutes? Opposed? Abstentions? We have 1 abstention, Mr. Mottola. Okay. we'll take the September 15th, 2015 minutes. And before us, Mr. Brown, Mr. Walsh, second. Any questions, comments, concerns on these? Okay, all in favor? Opposed, abstentions. That one passes.
No, just, I'm
Sorry.
sorry, I get my hand up in time.
Oh,
My,
we already approved that, I didn't hear
oh,
it,
no,
I'm sorry.
well, just for note, it's called regular monthly meeting.
Oh, it's the
It's actually
capital.
the capital planning meeting.
Okay, thank you, Mr. DeWitt, for finding that, and I'm sorry I missed your hand. We'll go to the September 29th, 2015 minutes. Can somebody put it before us, Mr. Brown? I'll take Mr. Stone. Any questions, comments, concerns on these minutes? Seeing none, all in favor of approving these? Opposed? Abstentions? We have Mr. Stone, Mrs. Leclerc, and Mr. DeWitt. All abstain. Okay. Item number 10, to hear, consider, and act upon any communication. So, what I want to bring up under this item, which should have been on the agenda this evening, was a brief conversation we had at our last meeting regarding the quarterly review meeting for the first quarter, and whether we actually need that or not. Now, our calendar's already set for this year. Obviously, at our December meeting, we're going to talk about next year's calendar, correct? But I believe the quarterly, when is our quarterly scheduled for right now? Do you remember?
I want to say that, I don't,
It's like a couple weeks?
yeah, I'm drawing a blank on the exact date.
Yeah. So I think that Mr. Walsh had brought forth the idea of, do we really need it? Because, 24, thank you. Because typically when we discuss at that meeting, yes, what we discuss at that meeting generally comes down to, oh, it's a timing issue, right? So going through the financials, it really, it doesn't make much sense, right? I would argue, though, and we could do it either at a separate meeting, or we could do it at kind of an addition to, one of our monthly meetings. There still are things we should probably be reviewing, not having to do with the actual financial statements themselves, but things such as projects that need to be closed out in the financial statements, things as the status of the contingency account that we want to go back for, and really a special agenda to, and I'll allude to a comment that Mr. Becker made earlier about sometimes we don't get back and follow up on some things that maybe we should. But really, my thought is that it should be kind of a cleanup meeting to make sure that we follow up on items that perhaps it's a waste of time, or Mr. Mayor, you could take 10 minutes and talk to us about any extraordinary things that are concerning you 5 months into the year, right? Hey, these are the things I'm noting that are a concern, or else we're on track. And oh, by the way, here's where we stand with capital projects. Here's where we stand with the contingency account. Here's where we stand with any information we have from our audit at that point in time. Here's where we have any information related to the budget process from our budget review meeting. Things such as that we need to follow up on, but to Mr. Walsh's point, it doesn't waste our time talking about a whole bunch of timing differences. And I wanted to throw that out there for brief discussion. Mr. Walsh?
I like what you just said to some degree, because I think we should cover some of those issues. My bigger concern was that, and Jim Brown and I were on the reports committee that actually talked about what we expected to see at these quarterly meetings was, since a lot of the issues are timing issues, do we waste a lot of, because we've met with Mr. Mayor, Mr. Mayor's come to our reporting committee meetings, and it takes, when he sends out requests to the department heads, for them to go through and to see whether it meets those variances and what the reasons are, and we get from each department 30, it's a timing issue because we're in the first quarter, seems to be a waste of town resources for the first quarter. So I guess the question is, should we, to some extent, waive that requirement of producing that report?
Right.
And have Mr. Mayor somehow, we can get direction from all of us, go to the department heads and say, hey, is there something unusual going on in your department this quarter that I, as the fiscal officer, should know about?
Right.
But we're also trying to save you some time for the first quarter only.
Yeah.
but also handle some of the issues you're talking about to try to make it a worthwhile meeting.
Exactly.
So I guess, you know, and Mr. Mayor, I don't know whether you have any input on how we could do all of that.
Yeah, excuse me. The Finance Department actually has taken the lead from the comments that were made at the last meeting. We sent out a limited request for information to the department heads. So we are gathering information, but not as in the detail that we usually do on the quarterly. And there's some items that obviously we in finance are aware of that we were going to bring. So we were actually probably not to the detail level that the chair just spoke to, but we were going to kind of bring a truncated analysis and an update on what was going on. So that kind of was our plan, and if I jumped ahead, I apologize.
No, that's good. Mr. Brown, you had something, then I'll go to Mr. Becker.
We also will have the munis reports anyway, right? So if we have any questions for the first quarter, we could just go to the munis report.
Well, the problem with the munis, I'm just telling you, I believe the problem with if we have all the munis reports showing the variances, and correct me, anybody here, anybody correct me if I'm wrong, is I don't know whether the staff here, it's generally Bob and Caitlin, are going to know the reason if you start saying, okay, on page 32 of the expense report and this department line this, it seems like we have a variance.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, if anyone has any questions on the munis report, they can get in touch with the finance department before the meeting.
Okay, so have it distributed?
prior.
Have it distributed,
Idea.
but if you have any questions, you have to go to finance for that specific
And
question.
we can go through Mr. Flynn to finance.
Sure. Okay.
Well, and Mr. Mayor's the font of all knowledge anyway, so he'll know right off.
And this is-
The font of all knowledge is right next to my office.
Just to clarify, we're talking first quarter only.
First quarter only, yeah. What does anybody else think? Yeah, exactly. Mr. Becker, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, so, Board of Ed, obviously, make sure they're aware of
Same
this
thing,
conversation.
right.
Especially with this maybe truncated version, and then whatever copies of their reports a little
Right.
bit lighter. Just so, I don't know if they've heard
And I
from
think
our
they
meeting.
probably do it anyway for the Board of Education. I think we
Yeah,
just
maybe they're
piggyback.
already, yeah, so, the other one is, I actually like the idea on the capital one. That's something that post the work of the reporting committee, because I was a little bit out of the earlier tenure
Yeah.
moving to this board, but it was something I'd always kind of wanted a little more updating on. And then we had that big cleanup of years of it, and it kind of sparked it. We talked about it, I know I went to Mr. Brown about it, we talked about, how to kind of manage it, but bringing up it every quarter didn't really make a lot of sense. So maybe that once a year timing actually works very nicely for that, because it isn't important. There's a lot of money on the table there, but it'd be tough to chase every quarter, so it probably fits nicely.
Great.
So.
Mrs. Leclerc, did you have something? No. Mr. Brown, could we do the budget meeting that night too, the Budget Committee?
I will commit to that.
Okay.
Yes, I
Yeah,
will.
okay.
We will have it.
All right, because that'll fit in nicely as well. So that way,
The calendar
right, well, that way,
by the December meeting.
right, so that way we can have a nice working session at that quarterly meeting, and it can be productive and not about timing
that's a great
differences. Okay, is everybody good on that? Great.
Yeah.
That's all I have. Does anybody else have any communication for the board tonight? Seeing none, thank you, everybody, and I'll entertain the last motion of the night, the most important motion. Go to Mr. DeWitt, will seconded by Mr. Becker. All in favor of adjournment? Opposed? Abstentions? Good night, everybody. Thank you.